Welcome to the Peters Township Public Library. My name is Sue Miller. I'm the Assistant Director here, and we are thrilled that you can all come out and be with us this evening as we have a special guest here to discuss her book and a very intriguing story. There's a couple things that I would like to announce before we get started. Once we are done with the presentation, I'm going to announce we have some wonderful exhibits here, and there's some more on the upstairs level, and there will be some refreshments afterwards, so stick around for that. If you have not been to our library before, we have lots and lots of resources in print. We have audiobooks you can download for free, music for free, lots of different resources. And so if you haven't done so yet, I encourage you to get a library card, because everything that we have here is available through that, and they have them at the circulation desk. I'd also like to point out one program that we have coming up next month, and you got a little takeaway on your chair about this. It's Read Local, Eat Local. This is our first ever event that we're doing, that we're inviting. We have 21 local authors who are going to be coming to the library and showing their books, and you get a chance to meet with them, talk with them, get books from them, get books signed. And we're also going to have 3 food trucks out in the parking lot, so we can all get something to eat as well, which will be fun. So someone like Noretta here, who is one of our local authors, we're going to have several more, so we hope that you can come out for that. So next up, I'm going to introduce the president of our Peters Township Library Foundation, and she will have more to tell you. And her name is Maura Kelly.
Hi everyone. I wanted to thank you for turning out tonight. You have a lot of choices for what you could do with your evening, and I think it's great that we have a full house once again. It shows a lot about our community, expanded community, that you're willing to make the time for a program like this tonight. We do want to thank Margaret Deitzer in the back, one of our reference librarians, who organized tonight's program along with the help of the rest of the staff. She's probably embarrassed that I'm calling her out right now. But she did ask me to tell you that we want you to come to more programs. So after tonight's program, if you will see Margaret or another member of the library staff, we can get your email added so we can get you added to our online newsletter. Sometimes we have luck promoting our programs in the local papers and magazines, and sometimes we don't. We have a lot of other events that compete with us, so we try really hard, but if you want to know more about our programs, you can always find out from the online newsletter. I did want to tell you, for those who don't know, the Peters Township Library Foundation basically exists to support the library's efforts financially and with volunteers. So anything that falls outside the normal scope of work or budget, we help out with. When you make a donation to the library, it routes kind of through the foundation. We did want to also point out Tim O'Brien is going to be coming Wednesday, November 7th, and the foundation is sponsoring him. This is a huge deal if you're not familiar with his work. He wrote this book, I believe, it was 1999, and it was nominated for a Pulitzer. He speaks all over the nation. He's been called the Poet Laureate of Vietnam. It is on our high school reading list, as well as many other high schools all across the country and many universities. So we do have the books for sale, sorry, my props, for $10 if you would like to pick one up. And tickets for this event will go on sale in June. We do The foundation sponsors it, but we do charge for the program because we have to cover the expenses for it. So tickets will be $20 for adults, $15 for veterans, and $5 for students. And like I said, those tickets will go on sale in June. I did want to point out also, we own a couple copies of this PBS series, the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick PBS series, and Tim O'Brien is one of the experts on this PBS series, and we will be having a program later in October to talk more about Vietnam, but I can't remember the date off, or maybe it's August. Can't remember the date off the top of my head. Todd DiPastino, a local historian and executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, will be here to share some slides and memories from a group that he took for a 50-year anniversary tour of Vietnam recently, in the past couple months. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Matt Sharon, who is an 8th grade social studies teacher here in Peters Township, who will then introduce our author tonight.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Matt Sharon. I teach social studies across the street at Peters Township Middle School. I also frequent the library often. I work a great deal, thankfully, with Margaret Deitzer as well as Sue. When I was coming into the library 2 weeks ago, I saw a poster that said, a new book, Carl's Story by Noretta Willig. And I ran right up to Mrs. Deitzer and I said, that has to be Miss Willig from Baldwin High School. I graduated from Baldwin High School 35 years ago. And I pretty much weaseled my way in and said, I have to introduce Miss Willig, you must let me do it. So Margaret allowed that, and I thank you, Margaret. Miss Willig, 35 years ago, was one of the empresses of the English department at Baldwin High School. She was awesome. I never had Miss Willig as a teacher, but I can tell you something that she did when I was a senior has still influenced me today and has made a difference in me as a teacher. We had Miss Willig may not even remember this story. We had a special needs kid in our high school who used to go around like a car.
Oh, I remember that.
One day he had a crisis in the hallway. He said his car broke. He couldn't move. And here comes Nori Willig down the hall. I'm your tow truck. She grabbed this boy by the hand and towed him through the hall while he made his car noises, and she said she was a tow truck, and she got him to her next class. As a teacher, I can appreciate what Miss Willig did for that student. The impact that that lesson had on me is 35 years later. She wasn't even my teacher. The difference that Miss Willig has made in people's lives over her 33-year teaching career is unbelievable. I could not think of a better person to write a book like Carl's Story. She was found, the only living relative, and she accepted that responsibility, and it is a responsibility, and she told a great story. So I look forward to hearing what Miss Willig has to say, and it's my pleasure to introduce, and I can't call her Noretta, Miss Willig.
Miss Willig takes me 30 years going backwards. And I'm absolutely so excited to be here that I forgot to bring my notes in. Such a role model. Now there's another part to that story, because after I got him to the class, and his name was David Chittister, so we thought I didn't remember. When I got him to the class, I said, now what is the problem? Because you're going to have to go to the next class. And he said, I have a dead battery. And there was a big kid, football player, eventually went to Holy Cross, by the name of Bob Zielinski. And Bob was standing there, and I said, do you happen to have jumper cables? And he said, yes, I do. And he went on his shoulders, and Dave said, that'll do it. Away he went. It's such a great pleasure to be here. And as I said, I was so busy talking to people that I know who are here that I forgot to bring my notes in. But I got them, so don't worry. He tells me this is on, so let's see. It is.
You want the lights off?
If you'd like, yes, I think it's up to them, really, if they can see better. I want to first, before I begin, thank the people at Peters Township Public Library, starting with Sue Miller. Myra isn't here, but all the people that have contributed to this, and it takes a lot of people to fill a room like this, believe me. Stephanie, whose name last name I can't remember, did the display that you see over here. Ed is the audio-visual man. Carrie Weaver, I've been in touch with. But most of all, and I'm sure you know her, Margaret Dietzer, who has been my contact, who has worked with me and told me what to do and what not to do, and it's just been invaluable advice for me. They're a wonderful, wonderful team, and I have been in a lot of libraries lately, and believe me, they take the prize. So if you would join me, please. And I appreciate very much your coming out on a beautiful spring evening to hear about Carl's story. And Carl's story is a remarkable story, and I think when you hear it, you will agree. Carl was my father's only sibling, his older brother. And Carl was killed September 16th, 1918, in the Battle of San Miguel. In the Battle of San Miguel salient. And when I started this journey with Carl, I had no idea what a salient was. Do you? Well, I'll be glad to explain. It means, it's a cartographer's term, which means a break in the line. And in this case, the line was the Hindenburg Line that went all the way from the eastern portion of France, all the way through northern France and up into Belgium. And it was the line of German offense in the north. And they maintained this break in the line, I'm sorry, wrong button. I'm familiar with this one. They maintained this break in the line, right here. And it went from the town of, you can see it better actually on this map, from Pointe-à-Maison, which is here, down to San Mihiel, and then north again to a little tiny village there that's called Haudemont. In the middle of this area was the little town of Montsec. And Montsec was at the base of a mound, almost looked like an Indian burial mound, that was from the top of which you could see 360 degrees around the plateau. That was the German stronghold. They could observe people coming from all directions from there, and they could defend this area. They were very interested in defending it because through this section here went a number of very important railroad lines that brought the industrial material from the eastern France to the western side, and also it facilitated the troop movements from the eastern side of the capital, Paris, which is over here somewhere, down through and into the fighting areas. So the Germans had defended this area numerous times against the French and the English. They left it to the Americans to win it. They couldn't win it. And the importance of the salient was important on both sides. Now, in 1917, when Woodrow Wilson entered the war, which was April 1917, the United States Army numbered not quite 100,000 men. When the call went out for the enlistments and then eventually for the conscriptions, there were 1.5 million members to the United States Army. Wilson's objective was really twofold. He wanted a major American presence in Europe. He wanted, of course, a victory. And he wanted a victory that was exclusively solo American, because he felt that that would ensure the Americans a prominent place at the peace table which would follow. He named General John J. Pershing, nicknamed Black Jack, to be the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the AEF. And he personally ordered Pershing to do whatever it was that was necessary to win a major battle. Solo. Only American. See, the idea was that the French would fight alongside of the Americans. And Pershing actually had a difficult time convincing the leader of the French army, Marshal Foch, to allow the Americans to do this by themselves. But he did succeed. And he chose the area of San Miguel to be, this is confusing to me because it's not mine, I'm sorry. It was a new kind of fighting when he chose this area gave him the containment, let's say, the unity to be able to fight the way he wanted to fight. This was not going to be trench warfare. This was going to be what he referred to for the first time as a surge. We commandeered the word again in Iraq, when we surged in Iraq. The intention of this surge was to sweep over from the eastern side. You notice that there's the 5th Division, that's Carl's division. And they were to, over on this side, there was a little token kind of armed force, mostly French, because the French were not to fight, but they were to hold that segment over there to make sure that when they drove the German army through and out, that was the direction of the surge. Definitely a new kind of fighting for an American troop. Also, Wilson had ordered Pershing to have the best of the American military involved. So, the then Colonel George C. Marshall, whose name we know very well from World War II and who is responsible for the Marshall Plan that followed World War II. Marshall actually planned the logistics of the battle. Douglas MacArthur was there. He was already a brigadier general when he went to San Miguel, and he led his famous Rainbow Division, which I think was the 42nd Division. It was the first, George Patton was there, only a colonel. There's an apocryphal story of Patton on one side and MacArthur on the other, and they climb a little rise in the territory to look out for what's going on, and they meet, and they are discussing the battle, and there's an explosion. And later, when Patton wrote his memoir, he said MacArthur ducked first. And MacArthur said Patton ducked first. So the rivalry began at San Miguel, actually. It was the first air assault in all of history. And the air assault began 4 hours before the actual fighting to sort of soften things up as they do. And the air assault was led by Billy Mitchell, whose name would become world famous following World War I. Eddie Rickenbacker was there. Eddie Rickenbacker got his first ace at San Miguel. By the time World War I was over, he had 9. So all the heroes of the 20th century American military were at San Miguel. There was Marshall and MacArthur and Patton and Mitchell and Rickenbacker and also Carl Willig. Carl was 18 years old when he enlisted. He was the son of a German immigrant. He was a private, 5th Division, 60th Battalion, Company H. He enlisted in June of 1917. War had been declared in April of 1917. And what did he do? He put on a uniform. He got a little bit of training. He got a long boat ride. And he went to a place that everybody there referred to as over there. San Miguel was a 5-day battle. It began September 12th, mostly in the rain. It had rained solidly for 4 days prior to the opening of the battle. So when we think about it, they fought through all the muck and the mud of unplowed fields or replowed fields. There was no trench to hide in, there was no crevice anywhere, and they were wearing that heavy wool twill that would have been soaked absolutely to the skin. There was barbed wire to contend with. There was the nightmare of the gas to contend with. There was heavy artillery, and it was 5 days of that. On the last day, September 16th, 1918, 56 days before the end of the war, 1/2 hour, by the record, 1/2 hour before Carl's replacement arrived, Carl was killed. An eyewitness wrote to his parents, "A German high explosive burst near him, killing him immediately. He suffered no pain, my dear friends. Hit on the head and back, death was instantaneous." According to the battle plan, now we have to remember this was a surge, and according to the battle plan, the war moved on very quickly. So the troops were quickly reassembled, reorganized, pushed forward, and the new assault began within days. And that was the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which ultimately ended the war. The speed of the attack was the advantage, but the speed of the attack also brought enormous confusion. And in that confusion, Carl was lost. I, of course, never knew Carl. What I learned about Carl, I heard from my Aunt Gussie. Everybody should have an Aunt Gussie. I had 3 great aunts, actually. They were my father's aunts. They lived down the street from us when I was growing up, so I was maybe 9 or 10 years old when I heard all of these stories. And Lily was the person who she was the oldest, and she was the person who took care of the outside, the snow and the garden and so forth. Elsie was a fabulous cook. And Gussie knew everything. As I remember her, Gussie was tall and frail. My father said that she was sick all her life. And I do know that she never went out of the house. Literally, she never went out of the house. If she did go past the yard, it was to the neighbor, and that was all. But she knew everything. She knew about politics, she knew about history, she knew everything that was going on in the town, she knew about movies. I was very into movies at the time. Knew all the movie stars, who married who was doing what, everything. And she told me about Carl. And about the whole family. And I think back to this, I remember sitting in their dining room, which was where you sat. You didn't sit in the parlor. You sat in the dining room. And on the wall was my baby picture and Carl's picture. And so I thought about this later, and Gussie was probably about 10 years old when Carl was born. And Carl was the first grandchild, and he was the first nephew. And I think that he was Gussie's favorite, to tell you the truth. She told me about the boys and how they worked, the boys being Carl and my father, and how they worked in the family business, which was a saloon, a mill saloon in McKeesport. And they cleaned the floors and the tables and everything every day. And they also, in the summertime, they went to a farm that was owned by some relative of theirs that lived down on the Ohio River, because my grandmother didn't want them always in the smoke and grit of the bar. She also said that Carl was a big guy. She told me that he was, at the time that he enlisted, he was 6 feet tall. She said that he was a boxer, that he fought as a welterweight. So he was on his way to being a big man. And she also told me how devastated, absolutely devastated, the family was when Carl was killed. My dad was 16 years old when he lost his big brother. And if I came home from Gussie's house with a story about Carl, which I frequently did, my mother would say to me, no, you don't talk about him. That upsets your father. You don't talk about him. You keep that to yourself. But interestingly enough, Carl was very frequently with us in unusual ways. He was not talked about, certainly, but his presence was shadowing our home. When my older brother was eligible for World War II, my father said, and I'm quoting him, "No son of mine is going to go into battle. My son will not be cannon fodder." So my dad figured out a way to get him enrolled at age 17 in the University of Pittsburgh. That would keep him out. But, as irony would have it, he again became eligible in the Korean War. And this time again, my dad said, no son of mine is ever going to fight on foreign soil. Period. And you had to know my dad to fully appreciate that. Some of you did. I recognize a couple people here who actually knew him. And that time, I don't know how he did it, but Walt spent his entire service period at Fort Lee, Virginia. And he used to say later, my brother used to say later, that during the Korean War, he flew a typewriter. All his life, my father clung to the idea, it never happened, but he clung to the idea that my two brothers would go into business together. And he would say, I'd like them to have the partnership of brothers, which I never had. So in these kind of different ways, Carl was there at times. When my mother would get exasperated with my dad, she'd say, if only Carl had lived. She'd like the older brother to take care of a few things. Carl was very often with us. But I remember actually my dad only telling one story about Carl. The family lived, he'd set the scene the same way, always. The family lived behind their business, which I said was the Willig Saloon. And they did very well on a hill called Riverton, up above the National Tube Works, which was the United States Steel Plant in McKeesport. And then he would tell this story about how Carl went to work in the mill as soon as he graduated, I think only from 8th grade. And as soon as he got out of school, he went to work in the mill as his father had done. My grandfather came to this country at age 14 and began to work in the mill there. And then one night, as Carl worked for more money, so he worked what was called the day shift. It was started at noon and ended at midnight. 7 days a week and then 6, 13 days straight and then the day off. And then it started again. And one night when in the mill, there was an accident. and Carl broke his leg. I may need light here. Carl was due home shortly after work ended. No later, it's okay, no later than 12:30. And my grandfather always waited for him before closing up for the night. When Carl did not arrive by 1 in the morning, his father, Henry, locked the door. Henry believed in rules, and as long as Carl lived in his house, Henry would enforce them. When Carl dragged himself painfully with his broken leg to the back porch, his father was sitting at the kitchen table. Carl, seeing him there through the window, tapped on the glass. Henry did not respond. Carl rapped harder. Henry ignored him. Carl, hobbling on his broken leg, pulled himself to the door and, enraged, pounded continuously until the old man, stocky, strong, and stubborn, unlocked the door. Rushing in, Carl picked up his father, drove him across the room, and set him on the kitchen table. With his face inches from his father's, spitting through clenched teeth, Carl snarled, "Now you listen to me, old man. Don't ever do anything like that to me again." And with that, my father would sit back, take a deep breath, and say, "From that night on, old Henry never bothered my brother." And then he'd wistfully turn away, and I can see him doing this. He'd say, "Oh, Carl was tough. He was wiry and tough." And there he is. He doesn't look tough to me. What comes to your mind?
Mama's boy.
Mama's
Mama's boy.
Mama's boy. Probably. Anything else? Young.
Sensitive.
Again, please.
Sensitive.
Sensitive. Somebody said he looks sweet.
Yeah.
He looks so innocent.
I was going to say that. You think it doesn't look like he has any,
I'm sorry?
You hadn't had to shave yet.
No, well, interesting. Oh, I'll add to that. That's George. I'll add to that when I get there. See, he did. He learned that over there. When I look at him, I sometimes wonder this. What color were his eyes? Were they the soft gray that they appear to be here? We'll never know. I'll never know. My grandparents are, of course, gone. And everyone who ever looked in his eyes is now gone. My aunts, who told me so much about him and about my family, my mother, my father, both of my brothers, they're all gone. And Carl was, I confess, almost forgotten. But I'm still here.
I have a question.
And in November 2008, my telephone rang, and a genealogist from Oregon told me through a series of questions that I was Carl's next of kin. Her job, she said, was just to find me. And I pressed her a little bit. I said, "Well, what is this about?" She said, "The Army, I'm in the employ of the Army, and they'll contact you." And I said, "Well, what are they going to tell me?" This was, 90 years after his death. And finally, in pushing her a little bit, she said, "Well, they probably found something." And that was it. She said the Army would call. Well, the Army didn't call for 4 months. And that found something, what could it possibly be? I thought about maybe it was a dog tag. Then I had to find out if they used dog tags in World War I. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. And then I thought of this. This is Elsie's trunk. Notice A&P Pittsburgh. Now my brother, when my father died, Elsie went into an assisted living. And my brother took her trunk and put it in his basement. And when my brother died, it was just about to be thrown away. And I said, oh, no, don't throw that away. Give it to me. And I did the same thing that my brother had done, which was put it in my basement and not look at it. I don't think my brother ever looked into it at all because he never said anything to me about anything that was in there, and I'm sure he would have if he had seen it. When I opened it up, it became the primary resource for my family. It was filled with hundreds and hundreds of loose photographs. There were a few albums of photographs. The albums were deteriorating around the photographs. There were 3 enormous family Bibles in German. And everything that Gussie had ever told me, as I looked at those pictures, everything that she had ever told me came flooding back into my memory. That's one of the pictures. Now that's Henry, strong and stubborn. My grandmother, Carl, and this guy is my dad. This is Carl, the taller boy, and my brother having watermelon, and that happens to be in Elsie and Gussie's backyard. That's young Carl. I think possibly this is the graduation picture. He looks maybe 13, 14 years old, but he's tall, he's straight, he's proud, and look at his hands. He's going to be a big man. Everything 3 or 4 or 5 years, 4 years, no more than that, after this picture, Carl enlisted in the service. And when he enlisted and was going over there, everything changed. Their whole lives, everybody's life changed. After he was killed and lost, they accepted that he was killed. I really think they all accepted that he was killed, but they could not bring themselves to accept that he was lost. You know, think about losing a child, just gone. Losing a precious object is bad enough. This was their child, their oldest, firstborn. I got, when they couldn't accept his loss, my grandmother and my grandfather began an incredibly large correspondence to the Army. Letter after letter after letter after letter. And I got all of those letters when I got Carl's personnel file. And in his file, his father had insisted that everything be put into a single place. And they wrote to everybody to try to find him. It was very clear that when they were writing through all those 10 years and beyond, Henry died in 1928, and 10 years almost to the day after Carl. And it was very clear that it was just a constant stream. They wrote to the adjutant general of various segments of the Army. They wrote to the person who was in charge of the Grave Corps, which takes care of the burials in the Army. They wrote even to the man who was the chairman of the Committee of Foreign Affairs for the 66th Congress. We are now in the 115th Congress. And all the replies that they received for these letters were polite. Everyone tried, I think, very hard to accommodate their requests, but it was simple fact. Carl was lost. The army couldn't find him. They weren't doing what Henry wanted them to do. So what was the answer? Henry and his wife, my grandmother, went to France to find him themselves. In 1922, they boarded a ship called the Homeric, and they sailed from New York to Cherbourg. And then, arriving in Cherbourg, they traveled all the way across France to the Rhine. They visited every possible place that they thought there could be a clue. How they did this, I'll never know. It was only 4 years, remember, after trench warfare right through this whole area. Hotels, restaurants, think about this, roads, transportation. I don't know how they could possibly do it. All I know for sure is that Gussie told me, and I can hear her saying this to this day, they walked up and down through the white crosses. And that is sitting in some cemetery in France. In the background there, you can see, it's a very old photograph. There's all the white crosses. That's Henry. That's my grandmother. And there's a third person in that picture. I don't know who that is. I have no idea. They looked for anything they could find, and there was nothing. They stayed for 6 months, and it was still all for nothing. Carl was gone, and he was lost to them forever. So they came home, and they put a marker in the cemetery. That was set in 1923. And it said on the stone, the only thing that they really knew was that he was somewhere in France. Henry died 10 years after Carl, and he was truly a broken man. I go into this a little more in the book, but Henry suffered those 10 years terribly for the loss. My grandmother suffered also because she wore black, the black of mourning, for the rest of her life from 1923, when they came back from Europe, until she died in 1944. Never a color. My dad died in 1973, and by 2007, both of my brothers were gone, and that's how I became Carl's next of kin. In March of 2009, the Army representatives finally did arrive at my front door from Washington, and they presented to me what they had found. And what they had found is documented in what I refer to as the Black Book. That's the documentation of his discovery and of his identification. There were 14 PhD MDs who went through this and were verified by a whole other corps of scholars to arrive at the conclusion that I'm about to tell you. They go through the historical stuff. Those are just maps and the verification of where he was, when he was, who else might have been there. What you see in red is what they actually found.
We have the lights.
Yeah. That's what they actually found. And it verifies, if you can see it, that the eyewitness said that he was hit from behind, and in his head and his back are gone. There's only one vertebrae remaining. This one's kind of interesting. These are his boots. And this is a replica of what those boots really were. They're the famous Pershing boots that were designed by Pershing himself with about a half-inch leather sole that was hard as a wooden sole with a iron tip and a steel toe. And that was so that they could go through the barbed wire. The French clipped and walked through. The Americans went through the barbed wire. Behind the tanks. It's a fascinating study, this bit of documentation here. They introduced me, these people that came from Washington, introduced me to an organization in France called Thanks GIs. Have any of you ever heard of it? No, no one. The mission of Thanks GIs is to honor American soldiers who liberated them not once but twice. And it was primarily the 5th Division that liberated the people of Lorraine in World War I and again in World War II. Same route that took them north to the town of Metz. The president of Thanks GIs, who is Elizabeth Gozo, wrote this to me. We know the terrible cost of our freedom, and to help the heroes like your uncle to be back home is the least we can do for those who did so much for us. It's an incredible organization. They are relic hunters, that's true, and they are reenactors, and they pay homage to the American military on every holiday, both French and American. This is Elizabeth Gozo. And this here is a man by the name of J Snyder. And his name tells you the history of the region. Roger, French, Schneider, German. This is Alsace-Lorraine, which went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And one day, looking for relics, Roger entered a woods near an old farmhouse. And Roger happened to trip. And what he tripped on was a bone. And it was Carl's heel bone, which, as it was photographed, was up out of the dirt because it had moss on it. It had been there for quite a while. And when he looked further, and he did root around a little more, because he thought it was an animal bone, they discovered human remains. And then he did something that a lot of people consider very odd, but let's think about it. He pushed all this stuff together, put it in a plastic bag, and buried it again. Because he didn't want to do the decision-making on what was to be done, and he didn't want the site disturbed. Now, he happened to be a member of Thanks GIs. And so he went and told Elizabeth that what he had found, and Elizabeth says, oh, we must report this. So she reported it to the local police, and the local police got in touch with the Army, and there happened to be a JPAC unit about 20 miles away. Now, normally JPAC is currently working almost always in the Pacific Rim. World War II is their focus, and they feel that most of the recovery has already taken place in Europe. But they were on special mission to France. And they happened to be there. It was 2 days before they were ready to leave. And if they had not happened to be there, then all this would have been gathered up and it would have been put in some kind of a container and would have been taken to the local cemetery, which was the cemetery at Thiaucourt. And they would have buried it under a cross marked unknown. But they were there. And they excavated the site. This young fella is part of the team that comes from Hawaii. And so they took all of the remains together out of the site, and they pretty closely identified that they had actually had 3 recoveries here. 3 soldiers. The forensic anthropologists go to work on this one and get it back to Hawaii, and they separate the bones. They identify that there were, in fact, 3 individuals. Each part, each bone, was meticulously studied and tested and described and photographed. Then, actually, you'd say, well, okay. But then the real hunt began. Because now they have to figure out who they are. The historians take it then. And they go by a process of elimination. They research every person who could possibly have been in that locale at that time, that precise day, that precise time, and who was there. Every possibility has to be accounted for. If they survived, or if they didn't survive, if they're among the missing, or if they're whatever. They've got it down to 5. 5 people that were difficult to deal with. One they discovered had been returned many years before. Another they discovered was found and buried at the cemetery at Thiaucourt. Now, finally, they know that they have 3. Costello, Weichel, and Willig. But who's who? Goes on. They did know immediately that one of them had a broken leg, had a broken leg. But they didn't know my dad's story. So that didn't mean anything to them. They collected all of the personnel files and found that one soldier had enlisted. Only one of the 3 had enlisted. And that his father had happened to ask that all of those records be brought into one place. Because he enlisted, he had a dental record. If you were conscripted, you didn't get a dental exam. But he had a dental exam. And finally, there is a last coincidence. That's his broken leg. The last coincidence is his jawbone was preserved, and Carl, his dental record showed, had a gold crown at number 31. And there was a big to-do about the identification of which tooth, because the numbering of teeth, believe it or not, had changed 4 times from 1918 until they were working on it in 2006. 7. Now they presented this all to me, and when they presented it, they pushed across the table a paper for me to sign, which said that I accepted that this was in fact Carl. And when I signed it, I began the process to bring him home. He could have been buried at Arlington, he could have been buried in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii, he could have been buried any place I wanted him. But I knew that my grandfather, my grandmother, and my father would want him at home. Carl was accompanied on his journey home by Sergeant First Class Alvino Perkins, who remained with him through until his burial. He was flown from Hawaii to Atlanta, and then an honor guard transferred him in Atlanta to the plane to Pittsburgh, and we met him at Pitt International by then. And the members of the 99th, which was then at Coriopolis, which has now been absorbed into the 316th, met the plane and brought him to Slater's funeral home in Whitehall. And some of you will know that I taught John Slater too. Now this is the honor guard as they are taking him from Slater's to the burial site. And I want to pause here, and I will say it probably again, but I want to really express with enthusiasm my respect for the United States military. I was raised in a family that didn't have a whole lot of respect for the respect for the military, but we didn't talk about the military. I didn't know anybody that was in the Army. My dad didn't have them in the house probably. But the care and the civility and the honor that they brought to all of this and to the fallen, to all of the fallen. And I've come in contact with many, many, many military since I've begun these talks. And without exception, they are unique and wonderful people. I've never been able to thank them, because as soon as I start to thank them, they say, "It is my honor, man. It is my honor, man." We can be very, very proud of the people in our military. On a beautiful spring day, June, that had turned beautiful after a downpour of a rain, Carl was taken to the McKeesport Versailles Cemetery. And with full military honor, he was laid to rest there. The piper played Going Home as we entered the cemetery. He played Amazing Grace as we left. Pastor Tom Dougal, who was an Army chaplain, spoke eloquently about Carl and about the family and about his service. There was a rifle volley in his honor. They folded his flag after the playing of the taps. And into his flag went the spent shells of the volley, which mean duty, honor, and country. Eric Goss, who is truly one of the finest people I've ever met, was in charge of the ceremony and gave Carl his final salute. And finally, he rested his mother, his father, and my dad on the opposite side of the stone. He once, in a letter that I found but never read, when I was a teenager, I found this, but it was so poignant that I never finished reading it. It was none of my business because we didn't talk about Carl. Carl had written to my brother and said, "To my dearest brother." And with Carl's burial, the page turned. But I'm too much like my grandmother and grandfather. I wanted to see where he had fallen. So I went to France. And I met Elizabeth. And I met her husband, Hélène. And I met a man by the name of Philippe Germain, who was our driver. And he was just fabulous, just a great, terrific person. And I met Roger, who had found Carl. And this is in Elizabeth's kitchen. And he is telling the story, his wonderful story of when he tripped and found Carl. And he was only in French, and I don't really speak it. But you could tell. He was so enthusiastic and so proud. He had told that story many, many times before and would tell it until the day he died. And then I gave him a memento, I guess, a little book of pictures. And Carl's picture, the one that you've seen in his doughboy uniform, was on the cover of that. And when he saw Carl's picture, he was stunned into silence. This man, he was so vital. And all he said is he stroked the picture, and he said, "C'est Jean. Oh, c'est Jean, c'est Jean." So young, so young. He saw for the first time the person that he had found. Many moving moments in this story. Now, in addition, we visited Montsec, and you remember it was the German stronghold right in the middle of the salient, the high ground from which they controlled the whole salient. Now today, instead of the German stronghold, there stands this absolutely magnificent monument on the top of that hill. And as you get closer to it and walk up the steps into it, inside is the battle scene that shows in a beautiful bronze topographical map the battle and how it was fought. Every detail, every tree, every lake, every hill, every farmhouse, everything is there, every village. And Philippe, who is a wonderful historian, showed us the evolution of the battle. And you can see it sort of here with these red lines that tells you it was a certain place by that certain day. And he told the whole story again. Be very big, very big. Move, 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 move. September 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And he gets to the point where he says to me, "Do you see here? This is the farmhouse. And here is where we found Carl. You will see." And like that, we're in the car, and we're driving through this marvelous, tranquil scene. We drove through completely unscarred, where 100 years before the battle had been fought. And it was very hard to imagine that in the battle, over 3 million rounds of ammunition were fired, and 7,000 Americans died. And then suddenly we stopped. Elizabeth was out of the car in a second. Let's get the book. Elizabeth was out of the car in a second and spread the map on the hood. Again, she shows Pam and me the battle lines and the dates. You see, by September 15th, she says to me, the doughboys had advanced to this road. And I said, "You mean this road? The one we're on now?" "Yes, yes, yes," she replies and continues. "They were on the left side. Then on the 16th, they crossed this road and they go over the field here." And she moved away from the car and points toward a place on the forest edge where there is a large wood pile. "Look this way, Noretta. Just past the wood pile. Do you see how the tree line turns slightly to the left? When I nod that I see what she means, she says, "You see that place just past the woodpile is where Roger stumbled on the bones. Roger came to me. I reported to the local gendarme, as we must do, of course. The police notified JPAC. We were here during the excavation. That's where he was." So matter of fact, and so extraordinary. I walk across the road, suspended in time. Below me is the embankment where Carl and the boys of Company H huddled through the night of September 15th, waiting for the order to move. In the darkness, hearing heavy artillery being shifted, they decide the big guns are withdrawing. The Germans are pulling back. The small territory yet to gain will be quick and easy. There's the farmhouse. They must be careful. That's where the Germans could hide and overtake them. They will be careful to avoid it. As September 16th dawns in eerie silence, they wait. The cat and mouse game has begun. The day passes. They begin to assume that the Germans are gone. Suddenly the big guns pound their position. Then the gas. They must move. The order comes. As Company H scrambles up the embankment and crosses the road, shells explode all around them. I walk to the other side of the road, looking out over this wide, unbroken field. I imagine Carl in the mud, soaked to his skin from days of rain. What a long, long open way to go. Mortars and shells everywhere. How terrified he must have been. Or was he as tough as my dad said? Through intense fire he runs, slipping, crawling, lurching, reeling his way across this seemingly endless, unprotected ground. Not far from the line of trees, the barrage of enemy fire increases. Determined not to move back through the muck again, they hunker down in any ditch or crater they can find. Dropping to the flat firing position, Carl and his comrades return round after round. Then, as evening approaches, suddenly the enemy fire ceases. The Germans have been ordered to retreat. As Carl's company enters the woods, they thrash through thick underbrush to the edge of the dense tree canopy. Carl must have been so relieved when he found the safety of the trees there beyond the woodpile. They dig in for the night. Except for a sound of a random shell in the distance, the tall trees stand silent. The enemy is gone. Their battle has ended. The salient is closed. Victory is theirs. Certain that they have achieved their objective, Carl tells his buddies, quote, "We shall be relieved tonight." A German high explosive shell, random, untargeted, astray, hits Carl. Just there. Just past the woodpile, where the tree line turns to the left. Carl died. He suffered no pain, my dear friends. Death was instantaneous. Just over there. But Carl is not in those woods. 90 years, 91 years after his death, he was found, he is known, and he has been honored. Carl Willig is home at last. June 9th, 2009. If I may, Carl's story is, I believe, an American story. It is a story of triumph of hope. They wanted him home. They hoped for it, and he is home. I think Carl's story reminds us, perhaps, of our best selves. We see ourselves in it. One man told me that my mother reminded him of his mother. Several have seen a cherished aunt, not Gussie. The woman that told me that, her Aunt Lydia. Some also know how a death, the loss of a single life, can rock a family for generations. Through Carl's story, I think we have been able to meet an unsung group halfway across the world called Thanks GIs, whose mission is to honor our American military and the almost forgotten, who gave them their freedom 75 and 100 years ago. We're reminded also, I hope, of the intense dedication of the scholars like JPAC, whose discoveries move us forward every day of our lives. Carl enlisted, and today we have an all-volunteer army. Honoring Carl, I think, proves the dedication of the United States Army. No soldier is forgotten. No soldier is left behind. The military lives by the motto of the 5th Division, which is, we will. All of us from time to time, I think, are struck by the coincidences of our lives. I certainly was when my phone rang. In a real sense, I do believe that each and all of us have in our own way journeyed over there. Carl's story is an American story. It's our story. It has been my honor to tell you. And I'll be very happy to take your comments or questions. Comments? Yes, ma'am. Joint? Oh, joint? George, where are you? JPAC. Joint recovery. I don't know. It's the recovery. Do you know Pam? She's gonna look up. No, she was a captain in the Navy and she doesn't know, so I don't feel so bad.
No, it's joint, so it's all
It's-
services.
Yes.
MIA Accounting Command.
Say it again, Ed?
Joint POW MIA Accounting Command.
Thank you. I'll remember that. Yes.
Just by way of a coincidence, I am a Schneider.
Are you really? SCHNEI?
Our ancestors are all from Alsace.
Is that right?
How old was Roger?
Roger
My
was-
brother's name is Roger and my mother's name is Yvonne Snyder. I always wondered why she had half French, half German, but
There it is. How old was he? I met him in 2010, and he was probably like Pam, 65, 70. He's gone now. You notice in those pictures, the earlier picture of him and then the later one, he had become very ill. But yet there was a ceremony that followed all of this, which I don't have in the talk, but he carried the flag for the 5th Division, Roger did, and it was a struggle, believe me, but he was definitely going to do it.
So he would then now be in his 80s?
Yes, if he were living, he'd be in his 80s,
My
yes.
mother's 88. And
Oh,
so
my.
it's quite possible, I have to look through the genealogist, this is bizarre, that I should come tonight and see what
Yeah.
it looks like.
Please let me know.
I want to know more, if you can give me
If-
contact.
I will, I will.
I'll stop now.
Okay, no.
It's so cool, it's so cool.
I'm going to see Elizabeth in September,
Okay.
and I would love to know
My mother
this.
would flip her wig.
That's so stupid.
It would have been my great, Peter Schneider.
Peter Schneider. His son is Laurent. Laurent Schneider, and Laurent was with him when he found Carl, but I didn't get into that. Yeah. Please, anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Your
Barbara
family
Logan,
had-
hello.
Your family had very recently come from Germany. I wonder how people like that felt about fighting against the Germans.
Well, there's a postscript on that also. In addition to going to France, I went to where my grandfather lived. And while they were in France, where my grandfather was born, which was Hagenbach, Baden. And when I visited where his home had been and so forth. And I have pictures of, they went to the Rhine River and then they went down the Rhine to his home. Now that was 4 years after the war. And I have pictures of the family, of the German family, with my grandmother and grandfather in it. And I think about that too. What I have in the book says that, what did they think about under the same roof when they went to bed at night? The victor and the vanquished, who had cost the vanquished and cost the victor the sun. Incredible that they did. They were there for quite a while. And as I said, I have the pictures of that. That's another talk, that whole thing. Yes.
Did I read that it may have been German soldiers that buried?
Yes, that's correct. They think that he was buried by Germans because it was a very shallow grave, obviously. And the ammunition was still there. Now the pistols and so forth were gone, but the ammunition did not fit the German guns. So they think it was the Germans who probably covered him over. But they took the pistols because they were such collector's items. Yes. Oh, hello.
Have you ever met anyone else who had a family member recovered in the same way that Carl was?
No, I can't say that I have. No, I don't think so. There are 82,000 MIAs.
From
Man.
World War I?
No. But there were 284 in the Battle of San Miguel missing.
Yeah.
And another thing that we did, as this is another talk, this is the postlude. There's a wall in the cemetery at Thiancourt that is the tablet of the missing. And Carl's name was inscribed there. And when I went to France, they have a custom that when the person has been recovered, they put a little rosette into the wall, and I put the rosette into the wall.
That's awesome.
It's great. It's awesome. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What became of the young man who wrote the letter that said he died without paying?
I don't know. His name is John W. O'Hara, and if anybody knows of a John W. O'Hara, I would love to know about it, because I don't know who he is. He's from McKeesport somewhere, and I'm going to talk in McKeesport couple weeks, and maybe somebody there will know who this John W. O'Hara is. Yes, ma'am.
You may find it in the history of that cemetery that started at, I read about the cemetery before I came here.
Mm-hmm.
So I read about this, the cemetery. Because I went and thought, is that in Pittsburgh, the cemetery? Anyway, it started as Versailles Cemetery.
Yes, that's right.
And O'Hara
The O'Haras are
was
buried there.
involved in getting that land grant.
The O'Haras are buried there. That's correct. There are many O'Haras. But I can't get to John W. And I should go further and look further, but I don't know. Interestingly, my father never quite believed that that letter was accurate, but it's turned out that it is 100% accurate. Because in that letter, John O'Hara says that he died at 6:30, and the replacements came at 7 o'clock. Yeah.
It's been a while since I've read the book, but wasn't that his, like, either his company commander or his commander?
The company commander wrote to his
A
parents.
different, not
Yeah,
that.
did, no, not the same one. But his company commander did write to his parents and said, in the course of trying to find him, they contacted, the Brave Corps, I think, contacted the company commander to see if they knew anything. And then he wrote to my grandparents and said he was an excellent soldier. Carl was an excellent soldier. He called, the people that he fought with, the men in his company, called him the Tall Pennsylvanian. which is so early 1900s, isn't it? Yeah. Yes? Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Just on a personal note, how
I know you too.
you do?
I certainly
11th
do.
grade English.
Yes.
I was so excited to come. It's such an amazing story.
It is.
On a personal note, how did you get through all this? I mean, how many times did you cry? How many times were you just overwhelmed? How many
Often.
times could you not believe what was actually happening to
Yes,
you?
yes.
Because as a mother now, like, things that come up, just, they're amazing, you know? And for something like this,
Yeah.
I can't even wrap my head around it. How did you do, I mean, how did you do this?
At times with great difficulty,
Mhm.
truthfully. There are parts of the book that I read, I wrote, and then I read them once. And then after that, I didn't read them until I had to read them in proof. And then I will never read them again. There are parts of it that just, there are certain phrases that I've used that I can't use. I said to at one point, he was just a boy. And he was just a boy. And I think that is such a choker. Please tell me your name.
Gretchen Paparello.
Oh, yes, 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 okay. I knew you. I was looking at you in the dark. Yes, anything else? Well, I thank you very much for coming.
I just want to say, wow. That's an amazing story,
Remarkable story, as I
and
said.
you are an amazing storyteller.
Here, here.
Really, really very good. Yeah, amazing.
Been all my life.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to let you know what we have for the rest of the evening here. If you can stick around, we have some exhibits, and I'm going to introduce the gentlemen who have provided them for us. We have U.S. Doughboy uniform and World War I British uniform and other items provided by Michael Phillips. We have a collection of World War I Pennsylvania town, city, and country medals provided by David Burrows. We have World War I posters, books of World War I posters, and other items provided by Gerard Pasquarel. There is a diorama of World War I soldiers provided by Friedhelm Busch. There are photographs of World War I provided by Ralph Kessler. Those are going to be upstairs in our case upstairs. Ralph? Ralph, you want to stand up so we can all see you? And the World War I posters are provided by the Pennsylvania State Archives. So please stick around, talk to the presenters. Noretta's going to be up here with her book sale, is that correct?
I will, and I would like to tell you that if you buy a book, everything that I profit from the book will be donated. I won't see any money out of this. I'm looking right now at the customized wheelchairs, so it will go to some veteran who has definitely.
Thank you very much, and please help yourself to refreshments in the back.